Admiral Nathaniel Cross leaned into her face in front of every man on that field and said it loud enough for all of them to hear. "You don't belong here, Caldwell. You never did. And before this week is over, everyone in this room is going to watch you prove me right." He didn't whisper it. He didn't suggest it. He declared it like a verdict, like a sentence, like a man who had already decided the outcome before the fight even began. And every single operator standing in that formation heard every single word. If you believe that some people carry a story so powerful it can silence an entire room, subscribe to this channel right now, stay with me until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning formation at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado had never felt this charged before. 24 operators stood in perfect rows, every uniform pressed, every boot polished, every face carrying the particular kind of exhausted confidence that only comes from surviving weeks of brutal selection. These were not ordinary men. Every single one of them had already passed tests that broke the majority of candidates who attempted them. They had earned their position in this advanced combat leadership program through genuine sacrifice, genuine pain, and genuine excellence. And then there was Lieutenant Commander Maya Caldwell. She stood at the far right end of the formation, 34 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, a service record that, if you actually managed to access the unclassified portions, would tell you almost nothing meaningful about who she was or what she had actually done. Because the parts of her record that mattered most were buried so deep beneath layers of classification that even most senior officers at the Naval Special Warfare Center had never seen them. What the men around her saw was something entirely different. They saw a woman. They saw someone who had been placed among them not because she had earned it, but because somebody with power and political motivation had decided that the optics of exclusion had become too uncomfortable. That was the story circulating through the barracks, through the training facilities, through the mess hall, through every quiet conversation that happened whenever Maya was not standing directly within earshot. And sometimes even when she was, Lieutenant Cole Bennett had started it. Bennett was 29 years old, physically enormous, third-generation military, and possessed of the particular kind of arrogance that develops in men who have spent their entire lives being told they are exceptional. He had pulled 4 other operators aside during the first week of training and made his position absolutely clear. "She is here because somebody in Washington decided we needed a photo opportunity," Bennett said. "That is the only reason. Not because she passed the same tests we passed. Not because she survived the same selection we survived. Because somebody wanted a headline. Nobody in that small circle disagreed." And the story spread from there, gaining details and conviction with every retelling, until the entire class operated under the unspoken assumption that Maya Caldwell was a problem they were being asked to accommodate rather than an operator they were expected to respect. She heard it, all of it. Maya Caldwell had spent enough years in environments where survival depended on her ability to process information while maintaining a perfectly controlled external presentation to understand exactly what was happening around her. She heard the comments, she felt the looks. She noticed the way conversations shifted slightly when she entered a room, the way certain men angled their bodies away from her during briefings, the way even the instructors paused a fraction of a second too long before addressing her. She said nothing, because she had learned something years ago, in a place she was not permitted to discuss, that most of the men around her had not yet learned. Reaction was a tool, and like any tool, it needed to be deployed at exactly the right moment to be effective. Deployed too early, it simply proved the opposition's point. Deployed at the correct moment, with the correct weight behind it, it could change everything. She was waiting for the correct moment. Admiral Nathaniel Cross was the reason she had to wait longer than she would have preferred. Cross was 61 years old, and he carried 35 years of naval special warfare history in the way he occupied physical space. He walked like a man who had never once in his adult life questioned whether he deserved to be in the room he was standing in. His chest displayed a collection of decorations represented operations across 4 continents and 3 decades of genuine service. He had bled for his career. He had buried friends for his career. He had made decisions under conditions of extreme pressure that most human beings could not even conceptualize. And the fact that he was still standing, still commanding, still respected throughout the special operations community, said something real about who he was. But Admiral Cross also carried something else, something that existed beneath the medals and the reputation, and the carefully maintained bearing of a man at the peak of his institutional authority. He carried a secret. He did not know he carried it. That was perhaps the most significant detail. He had buried it so successfully beneath his own self-constructed narrative of the event that he had essentially rewritten his own history. He remembered the Afghanistan operation the way he needed to remember it rather than the way it had actually occurred. And that rewriting had consequences he could not see because he refused to look directly at them. The first time Admiral Cross spoke directly to Maya Caldwell, every man in the formation heard what he said. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment longer than he had looked at anyone else during the inspection. Not the look of a commanding officer evaluating an operator. The look of a man who had already made a judgment and was performing the ritual of examination as a formality. "Lieutenant Commander Caldwell," he said. "Sir," she answered. "How long have you been in naval special warfare?" 7 years, Admiral. 7 years, he repeated it. Not like a fact, like a question, like something he found difficult to accept as accurate. "And you believe that 7 years has prepared you for what this program demands?" Maya kept her eyes forward. "I believe my performance will demonstrate that, Admiral." Cross leaned slightly toward her, not aggressively. "Just enough. Performance under pressure," he said quietly. "Not performance in controlled environments. Not performance when the variables are manageable. Performance when everything goes wrong simultaneously and the person next to you is depending on you to make the decision that keeps them alive." He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "That is what this program measures. And that kind of performance cannot be simulated. It has to have been lived." He moved on, and every man in that formation processed what they had just witnessed. Lieutenant Ryan Mercer, standing 3 positions to Maya's left, felt something shift inside him that he did not immediately recognize. Mercer was 31, a former Army Ranger who had crossed into naval special warfare through a rare inter-service program, and he prided himself on reading situations accurately. He had spent the first weeks of this program forming the same general opinion of Maya Caldwell that everyone else had formed, because the information available to him pointed in that direction, and he had not looked for any other information. But watching Cross single her out that way made something uncomfortable happen in Mercer's chest, because he knew what it looked like when authority was used to wound rather than to correct. He had seen it happen to younger operators. He had seen commanding officers use their position to prejudge outcomes rather than evaluate them. And what Cross had just done to Maya Caldwell looked very much like that. He did not say anything, not yet. He filed the observation and kept moving. Maya filed it differently. She filed it the way she had learned to file every piece of relevant intelligence. She noted the specific words Cross had used. Simulated, lived. The implication being that she had not lived anything real, that her service existed only in controlled conditions, that the gaps in her visible record were absences rather than redaction. She understood why he believed that. She understood why everyone believed that. The design of her operational history required them to believe exactly that. But she also understood that Admiral Cross was not simply operating from incomplete information. He was operating from something more personal. She had seen his name in the original after-action report, the one that had never been officially released, the one that existed in 3 copies, 2 of which were sealed inside a facility whose location she was not going to disclose. She had read his name, and she had understood immediately what his presence on the list meant, and she had made a calculation about when and how that information would become relevant. She was still running that calculation. The barracks that evening were noisy in the way military barracks are always noisy, which is to say that the noise was purposeful rather than casual. Men cleaning equipment, men reviewing tactical materials, men engaging in the particular kind of competitive conversation that serves as both social psychological preparation for the next day's evolution. Maya sat alone at a table in the corner, working through a physical assessment form, and for the first 45 minutes, nobody spoke to her directly. Then Bennett walked over. Cole Bennett at 29 was the kind of physical specimen that made certain people assume that physicality was the primary ingredient of special operations capability. 6'2", 220 pounds of genuine muscle. A face that wore its confidence like a second uniform. He pulled a chair out from the table across from Maya, turned it around, and sat on it backward with his arms folded across the top of the back. The pose was deliberately casual, the kind of casual that is constructed to convey superiority. "Can I ask you something, Caldwell?" he said. Maya looked up from her form. "You're going to, regardless." Bennett almost smiled at that. "Almost. Fair enough. I want to know what you actually did for 7 years. Because I've talked to people. I've asked around. And nobody seems to have any specific information about what Lieutenant Commander Maya Caldwell has actually accomplished in her career." "That's correct," Maya said. "That doesn't bother you? That nobody can verify anything about you?" "It doesn't bother me that my record is classified, no." "See, here's the thing," Bennett said. He leaned forward slightly on the chair back. "Classification is real, I get it. Operations that can't be disclosed, assets that need to be protected, all of it. I respect that, but there's a pattern to classified records. When an operator has genuinely done significant things and those things are classified, the people who worked alongside them know. The community knows. Word gets around, even when the official record doesn't. And I have talked to people throughout this community for the past month, and nobody has heard anything about you that would explain why you're standing here." Maya set down her pen. She looked at him for a moment. A real look, not the flat professional gaze she typically maintained. "Something more direct than that. Did it occur to you," she said carefully, "that the reason nobody has heard anything about me is precisely because the operations I was involved in were handled correctly?" Bennett frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means that the standard of classification I operated under was not the standard most operators experience. It means the people who worked alongside me are not permitted to discuss it. It means the community you're referring to doesn't have access to the relevant information, not because the information doesn't exist, but because it's contained in a way that makes containment effective." She picked up her pen again. "You're drawing conclusions from an absence of data and calling that evidence. That's not analysis, that's assumption." Bennett stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, put the chair back, and walked away without another word. 3 men on the far side of the barracks had been watching the exchange. They exchanged looks after Bennett walked away. One of them, a quiet operator named Torres, said to the others, very quietly, "She didn't back down an inch." Nobody responded to that out loud, but the observation stayed in the room. The next morning brought the first real evolution. Physical assessment, competitive format. The kind of exercise designed not just to test individual capacity, to reveal how individuals performed under observation, under comparison, under the specific psychological pressure of being measured against people who were also exceptional. It was a timed course that integrated swimming, climbing, obstacle navigation, and a weighted carry that, at its conclusion, required operators to make a series of tactical decisions under simulated fatigue. Maya arrived at the staging area and immediately noticed something wrong. Her weight vest was heavier than it should have been. She picked it up and she could feel it, not dramatically heavier, not obviously heavier, heavy in the careful, calibrated way that suggested someone had made a considered adjustment rather than a careless mistake. She turned the vest over in her hands. She checked the seams, the pockets, the distribution points. Someone had added weight distributed it in a way that would shift her center of gravity during the swimming portion and create additional stress on her shoulders during the climb. It was sophisticated enough to be intentional, subtle enough to be deniable. She looked around the staging area. Nobody was looking at her, which was itself a kind of answer. Mercer was 2 positions away, adjusting his own equipment. He glanced over at the same moment she was turning the vest in her hands, and for a brief moment their eyes met. He had seen enough. She knew he had seen enough. She put the vest on. She adjusted her posture to compensate for the altered distribution. She did not say a single word. The evolution started. What happened over the next 90 minutes was something that several of the men who were present would discuss for years afterward, though not always in the same terms or with the same emphasis. The objective facts were straightforward. The weighted carry segment had been designed with the modified vest in mind, clearly intended to slow her down enough that the time gap between her performance and the top performers would be both measurable and visible to everyone watching. Instead, Maya Caldwell finished in the top third of the field. Not first, not in a way that announced itself dramatically. In a way that was quiet and clean and undeniable. She came out of the water, moved through the obstacles, and completed the weighted carry in a time that, given the actual weight she had been carrying, represented something that several of the instructors could not immediately explain. Commander Ethan Whitmore, who was running the evolution, looked at the numbers twice. He was not a man who showed confusion easily, but something shifted in his expression as he looked at the data on his clipboard. Mercer finished the evolution 2 positions behind Maya, and when he reached the staging area at the end, breathing hard, he stopped near her and said quietly, "That vest was wrong." "I know," she said. "You should report it." She looked at him. Her breathing was already returning to normal. To who? He didn't have an answer for that, because the answer to that question, in the specific situation they were both standing in, was the thing that made it complicated. Reporting it meant accusing someone, which meant an investigation, which meant attention directed at her for a reason that had nothing to do with her performance. It would reframe the conversation from what she had accomplished to what had been done to her. And reframing the conversation that way was not something she was willing to do. "Mission comes first," she said, "always." Mercer wiped sweat from his face and said nothing. But he was thinking something. She could see him thinking it. He was revising something in his internal model of who she was, and the revision was not small. That evening, Admiral Cross reviewed the day's performance data in Commander Whitmore's office. "She finished in the top third," Whitmore said carefully. "I can see the numbers," Cross said. "The vest she was wearing was not standard issue." A pause. "Meaning?" Whitmore chose his words. "Meaning the weight was not within specification. I had it measured after the evolution. It was carrying an additional 11 pounds distributed in a non-standard configuration." Cross set the report down on the desk. He looked at it without picking it up again. "Accidental error in equipment distribution? That is one possible explanation," Whitmore said. Cross nodded slowly, "Documented as equipment variance. Have all vests rechecked before the next evolution." Whitmore looked at him for exactly 1 second too long. "Yes, Admiral." Cross picked up the report and left. Whitmore sat alone in his office for a long moment. He opened the performance file. He looked at Maya's numbers again. He thought about the 11 extra pounds. He thought about the top third. He closed the file, but he did not forget what he had seen. 3 days later, Bennett tried something different. The tactical briefing room held 12 operators for the evening session, a review of the upcoming maritime exercise scheduled for the end of the week. The briefing was led by one of the senior instructors, and it covered insertion points, extraction protocols, communication procedures, and contingency responses to 6 different failure scenarios. Standard content, delivered at a pace that assumed every operator in the room had a foundational understanding of maritime special operations. Maya sat in the second row. She had her notebook open. She was writing nothing down because she did not need to write anything down, but she kept the notebook open because closing it would have drawn attention to the fact that she was absorbing the material without taking notes. And drawing that kind of attention was not useful at this moment. Bennett sat one row behind her. Halfway through the briefing, when the instructor paused to pull up a chart on the screen, Bennett leaned forward and said, just loud enough for the people around him to hear, "Does anyone else think it's interesting that Caldwell hasn't asked a single question in 3 days of briefings? Not one question." A few men nearby shifted slightly. The instructor had not heard, or was pretending not to have heard. Maya did not turn around. Bennett continued, "Because you know what that tells me? It tells me either she already knows everything being presented, which seems unlikely, or she doesn't know enough to even know what questions to ask." Someone near the back of the room made a quiet sound that was not quite a laugh. Maya turned the page in her notebook. Then the instructor brought up the next chart, which showed the approach vectors for the maritime platform exercise, and he said, "All right, the insertion window we're looking at gives us approximately 4 minutes of low visibility approach. Any questions on the approach parameters?" Maya raised her hand. The instructor nodded at her. She said, "The approach vector shown assumes standard tidal behavior for this time of year. But the forecast for Friday night shows a 15% deviation from standard tidal patterns due to the low-pressure system moving up the coast. Has the insertion window been adjusted to account for that, or are we working from the original parameters?" Silence. The instructor looked at his materials. He looked at the meteorological data attached to the briefing packet. He looked back at Maya. "That is an excellent question, Lieutenant Commander. I will have an updated insertion window to the team by 0600 tomorrow." Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Bennett was quiet. Torres, sitting near the back, looked at the ceiling briefly. Mercer wrote something in his own notebook. Maya closed hers. The briefing continued, but something in that room had shifted, and everyone felt it shift, and nobody was quite willing to say out loud what it was that had changed. After the briefing cleared, Mercer walked out behind Maya and caught up with her in the corridor. "That tidal variance," he said. "How did you catch that?" She kept walking. "I read the full briefing packet." "We all got the same packet." "Yes," she said. He walked alongside her for another few steps. "Did you read the meteorological addendum?" There was a meteorological addendum attached to the logistics section. Most people don't read the logistics section because it seems like administrative material. She glanced at him. "It isn't." Mercer said nothing for a moment. Then the vest situation. "The questions, the tidal variance. You're not what they said you were." Maya stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly. "What did they say I was?" He met her eyes without flinching. "A political appointment. Someone who passed because the bar was lowered." She held his gaze for a long moment. Her expression did not change. But something moved behind her eyes. Something that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it. Something that had been compressed into a very small space over a very long period of time. "Lieutenant Mercer," she said, "I need you to understand something. The bar was not lowered. The bar for what I actually do has never been lower than it was the last time I deployed. And the last time I deployed, the bar was the kind that determines whether people come home or don't." He stared at her. She walked away. He stood in the corridor alone, and he thought about what she had said, and he turned it over in his mind several times. He thought about the specificity of it. The last time I deployed. The kind that determines whether people come home. Not abstract statements, not defensive positioning. Specific language from a specific experience. He went back to his bunk that night, and he thought about it for a long time before he fell asleep. Cross met with Bennett the following afternoon. It was not an official meeting. It was the kind of meeting that happens in the margins of official schedules, when two people who share a perspective on something find a moment of shared privacy. They stood outside the equipment building, and Cross spoke quietly, and Bennett listened. "How is she performing?" Cross asked. "Better than we wanted," Bennett said. He was not embarrassed by the honesty of it. The vest thing didn't work the way it was supposed to. She compensated somehow, and she caught a title variance in the maritime briefing that the instructor missed. Cross's jaw tightened slightly. What about team dynamics? She keeps to herself mostly. Mercer has been spending more time near her, talking to her. I don't think he's convinced she belongs here, but he's watching her differently. Mercer is a good operator, Cross said. Smart. I don't want him confused by her. Bennett looked at him. What exactly are we trying to accomplish here, Admiral? Because if she keeps performing at this level, the numbers are going to be what they are. Cross was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had something in it that Bennett had not heard from him before. Something that was not quite certainty. There are things in her file that don't add up, Cross said. 7 years, classified service. Nobody who can verify what she claims. He paused. The maritime special operations community is built on trust, on verified capability, on knowing exactly who the person next to you is and what they're capable of. She is an unknown quantity, and unknowns are dangerous. So we keep testing her, Bennett said. We keep testing her, Cross confirmed. What neither of them said, because neither of them had fully articulated even to themselves, was that there was something about Maya Caldwell that made Cross uncomfortable in a way that he could not precisely define. Something in the way she held herself. Something in the way she processed information. Something in the specificity of her operational instincts that felt, to a man with 35 years of operational experience, very much like the product of genuine high-level experience rather than the product of training. And if her experience was genuine, then the questions that raised about her classified record were questions he did not know if he was prepared to face. He filed that thought in the same place he filed everything he was not prepared to face. He kept moving. Maya sat alone that night after lights out. She was not sleeping. She was running the operation timeline in her head the way she always ran it when she needed to think clearly. She could recite every detail of it with a precision that had never faded in 7 years, because some experiences inscribed themselves into a person's memory with a permanence that normal experience did not. She knew the insertion point. She knew the timing. She knew the terrain. She knew the weight of the men she had carried when they could no longer carry themselves. She knew the name of every operator on that list, including Nathaniel Cross. She had not sought this assignment as an act of revenge. That needed to be clearly understood, even if only by herself in the dark of a barracks room with 23 men sleeping around her. She had not come here to expose Cross or to humiliate him or to settle something personal. She had come here because the investigation had pointed here. Because the 7-year search for the intelligence failure that had compromised the Afghanistan operation had finally produced a direction, and that direction had led to this program, this command structure, this specific environment. She was not here to destroy anyone. She was here to find the truth. But she was also here because she had a right to be here. That part she needed to hold on to as well, not just as an investigative asset, as an operator, as a lieutenant commander with a service record that, if anyone could actually read it, would answer every question that Cole Bennett and Nathaniel Cross and Ryan Mercer and every other man in this program had been asking about her since the first morning. She thought about the Afghanistan operation. She always thought about it the same way. In sequence, beginning to end, the intelligence failure that exposed the team's position, the rapid enemy advance that cut off their extraction route, the 6 hours of holding in deteriorating cover before communications went dark, the decision that someone at senior command level had made that extended the extraction window by 12 hours rather than initiating an emergency protocol, the 12 hours that turned a manageable crisis into something that should have been a catastrophe. Should have been, because something else happened in those 12 hours. Something that the official record described only as an unidentified operative who facilitated the recovery of 6 American personnel and successfully extracted with all 6 individuals alive. Unidentified. She lay in the dark and thought about that word. Unidentified. as if she had been a force of nature rather than a person. As if the decisions she had made in those mountains, in the cold, in the dark, with 6 men who were not sure they were going to make it back, had been the product of some impersonal event rather than a human being who had looked at an impossible situation and chosen not to accept the word impossible. She had a name. The 6 men she saved had given it to her. Iron Widow, not because she was cold, not because she was ruthless, because she had walked into a situation that everyone else had written off as already decided, already lost, already over, and she had refused to accept the decision. Because she had fought with the kind of controlled ferocity that the men she was rescuing had never seen from anyone, male or female, in any context. Because when the last of them crossed into safe territory, barely able to stand, and they looked back at the woman who had brought them home, the word they reached for was not one of the usual ones. They called her iron, because iron does not break, because iron holds, because iron carries weight that would crush anything softer. She closed her eyes. She thought about what was coming. She thought about the maritime exercise at the end of the week, the one that Cross had moved forward specifically to test her under maximum pressure. She had already mapped the insertion point in her mind. She had already identified the underwater approach vector that the standard SEAL training model would not account for because it required a kind of environmental reading that was not teachable in a classroom. She had identified it the way she identified everything, by reading not just what the information said, but what the information implied, by following the data points that most people overlooked because most people were looking at the obvious path. She was not going to take the obvious path. She was never going to take the obvious path. Because the obvious path was what the enemy expected, and the unexpected was the only thing that had ever saved her. The maritime exercise was 4 days away. She could feel Cross watching her from the edge of every evolution, the edge of every briefing, the edge of every moment of the day when she did something that didn't fit the narrative he had already constructed about who she was. She thought about his face during the inspection, the pause, the leaning in, the words about combat being where people discovered who they really were. She thought, I already know who I am. She thought, the question is whether you're ready to find out. 4 days. She could wait 4 days. Iron holds 4 days past the way hard days always pass inside a military training environment, which is to say they pass quickly in terms of clock time and slowly in terms of everything else. Every evolution, every briefing, every meal, every moment of rest that was not quite rest carried the accumulated weight of what had happened on that first morning. Cross had thrown the vest on the ground. Every man present had seen it. And the silence that followed that gesture had been the loudest thing Maya Caldwell had heard in years. She let it settle. She let it sit. Because she understood something that Cross did not yet understand about her, which was that public humiliation only worked on people who needed the approval of the people watching. Maya had stopped needing that a very long time ago. In a very specific place, under very specific circumstances that had reorganized her understanding of what actually mattered and what did not. What mattered was the mission. What did not matter was what Cole Bennett thought of her over breakfast. But Bennett was not finished. The morning after Cross threw the vest down, Bennett approached her at the equipment station with 2 of his regular group flanking him at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate. He had a performance report in his hand, the daily assessment sheet that every operator received after each evolution, and he held it out to her like he was offering something generous. Top third, he said. Impressive numbers for someone carrying extra weight. Maya took the report without looking at him. Of course, Bennett continued, top third in a modified event with an unfair advantage kind of works both ways, doesn't it? Because now we don't actually know what your real numbers look like. We know what your compensated numbers look like, which isn't the same thing. She looked up from the report then, directly at him. My compensated numbers put me ahead of 11 operators who were not carrying 11 extra pounds. You can do the math on what my uncompensated numbers would have looked like. Bennett's jaw tightened. Math isn't the point. Then what is the point, Lieutenant? He held her gaze. The point is that you keep finding ways to make the numbers work for you. And I'm starting to wonder whether that's skill or whether that's something else. Something else, she repeated. Be specific. He was quiet for exactly 1 second. 1 second where the two men behind him shifted slightly and the morning air held itself still. Politics, he said. Maya looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that Bennett's certainty flickered almost imperceptibly at the edges. Then she said, very quietly, very clearly, the next evolution is in 48 hours. I suggest you spend that time preparing for it rather than standing here. She walked away. Behind her, one of Bennett's flankers said something under his breath that she did not catch. But she heard Bennett's response, and his response was nothing. He said nothing, and his silence carried a different weight than his words had. Mercer watched the exchange from across the equipment station. He had been watching a lot of exchanges lately. He was making a file in his head, the way good operators make files, not out of loyalty and not out of suspicion, but out of the simple instinct that accurate information was more valuable than comfortable assumptions. The file on Maya Caldwell was getting thick, and the picture emerging from that file was not the picture he had started with. He caught up with her at the end of the morning's session. Bennett's going to escalate, he said, walking beside her, keeping his voice low and his eyes forward the way men do when they want a conversation to look like it isn't one. I know, she said. How do you want to handle it? She glanced at him. Why do you care how I handle it? He thought about that for a moment. It was a fair question. 3 weeks ago, he would not have cared. 3 weeks ago, he had the same file on her that everyone else had, thin and full of assumptions, and he had not looked past it because there had been no reason to look past it. Because I've been paying attention, he said. And what I'm paying attention to doesn't match what I was told to expect. Nobody told you to expect anything, she said. You built those expectations yourself from secondhand information. Fair, he said. I'm correcting for that now. She was quiet for a moment. They walked. Then she said, Bennett is not the problem. Bennett is a symptom. He's doing what he's doing because he's been given permission to do it. Implicit permission, but permission nonetheless. The question is where that permission comes from and why. Mercer processed that. Cross. She said nothing, which was its own answer. You think Cross is directing this, I think, she said carefully, that certain people in positions of authority have strong personal motivations to see me fail in this program. And I think those motivations go beyond institutional bias or gender politics, as real as those things are. Mercer stopped walking. She stopped 2 steps later and turned to look at him. What does that mean, he said. Strong personal motivations. She looked at him for a moment, measuring something. Deciding something. It means, she said, that this program is not just a training evolution for me. It is something more complicated than that, and I need you to trust me when I tell you that. He stared at her. Trust you based on what? I don't know you. No, she said. You don't, but you've been watching me for 3 weeks and your instincts are telling you something. I'd like you to follow those instincts. He held her gaze. His instincts were telling him several things, not all of them comfortable. But the loudest one, the one that his Ranger training and his naval special warfare experience and his 31 years of being someone who reads situations for a living were all saying simultaneously, was that Maya Caldwell was carrying something enormous. Something real. Something that went so far beneath the surface of what was visible that most people would never find it, even if they went looking. All right, he said, I'm listening. She nodded once. Then keep paying attention and stay close to me during the maritime exercise. She walked away again. He stood there for a moment. Then he followed. The maritime exercise brief came the following morning in Commander Whitmore's conference room. 14 operators, a screen full of tactile data, and an insertion timeline that Cross had personally revised to increase the difficulty parameters at 3 separate points. Whitmore delivered it professionally, but Maya could see in the set of his shoulders that he was uncomfortable with certain elements of the plan. He was a competent officer who had been given instructions by a superior and was executing them faithfully, and the faithfulness was costing him something. The scenario was a hostage rescue on a decommissioned offshore oil platform 15 miles from the coast. Night insertion. Cold water, 12-knot surface wind, creating operational sea state conditions that push the edges of standard parameters. The platform would be defended by a simulated opposing force using motion sensors, pressure sensors, and acoustic detection equipment positioned according to a textbook threat model. Two teams would insert simultaneously from different vectors. Objective was extraction of a simulated hostage package from the central operations deck. First team to secure the package and establish extraction confirmation won the evolution. Bennett's team had been given the primary insertion vector. Maya's team had been assigned the secondary. The secondary vector was longer, harder, more exposed to the acoustic detection grid. Everyone in the room understood the geometry. Bennett's team had a significant structural advantage built into the assignment itself. Maya studied the tactical display without expression. "Any questions on the approach parameters?" Whitmore said. Maya raised her hand. "Caldwell, the acoustic detection grid shown on the display assumes sensors positioned at standard depth for this type of platform," she said. "What is the current operational depth of the platform's lower access points?" Whitmore looked at his materials. "Lower access points are currently rated at the standard depth for this class of structure." "Is the rating current?" A pause. "The last assessment was conducted 8 months ago." "Has the platform experienced any structural settling in the last 8 months? Any storm activity that might have altered the depth profile of the lower access points?" Whitmore looked at her. Then he looked at the display. Then he looked at his materials again. "I would need to verify that against the most recent platform assessment data. Because if the lower access points have settled by even 2 to 3 feet," Maya said, "the acoustic sensor coverage would have a dead zone in the northwestern quadrant. A dead zone large enough for a small team to move through underwater without triggering detection." The room was very quiet. Bennett looked at the display. He looked at Maya. Something moved across his face that was not quite anger and not quite respect. It occupied the difficult space between those two things. Whitmore said, "I will verify the platform depth assessment data and update the briefing by 2200. He updated at 2130. The northwestern quadrant had a dead zone. It was not large. It was approximately 8 meters wide at its broadest point, narrowing to 4 meters at the base of the platform structure. Underwater, in limited visibility, with cold water and a current running at roughly 1.5 knots from the northwest, navigating through a 4-meter gap in an acoustic sensor grid while carrying full combat equipment was the kind of thing that the training model had not anticipated, because the training model was built on the assumption that operators would use the standard approach vectors. Maya had not planned to use the standard approach vector. She had identified this specific gap on her own 2 days before the briefing, not from classified access or superior intelligence, but from reading a platform engineering assessment that was publicly available in the Naval Facilities Database and cross-referencing it with a storm track report from 6 months ago. The information was there, all of it, accessible to anyone who thought to look for it in the right places. Nobody else had thought to look. She gathered her team after the updated briefing. 4 operators. Mercer was one of them, which was not accidental. She had specifically requested the team composition through Whitmore 3 days earlier, citing training objective compatibility. The request had been approved without Cross's review because it was a logistical matter rather than a command matter, and by the time Cross saw the team assignments, it was too late to revise them without making the revision conspicuous. She laid it out for them simply, no visual aids, just her voice and the map in her head. Standard insertion goes in from the east, the same direction as Bennett's team, just on the secondary vector. That approach takes us directly through the main acoustic detection grid. In 12-knot surface wind with the sea state we're expecting, noise discipline will be extremely difficult to maintain through that grid. We will be detected, probably within the first 8 minutes of approach. Torres, one of the four, said, so we don't use the standard insertion. We don't use the standard insertion, she confirmed. The northwestern quadrant dead zone, Mercer said. He had been listening to her since the briefing room. His voice carried the tone of someone who was confirming a conclusion he had already reached rather than hearing something new. The northwestern quadrant dead zone, she confirmed. It's 4 meters at its narrowest point. Underwater navigation with full equipment in a 1.5-knot current. Not comfortable, definitely possible. The fourth operator, a quiet Texan named Harlow, who had said almost nothing to Massam since the first day of the program, looked at the hand-drawn diagram she had produced from memory. He traced the approach vector with one finger. What's the floor visibility going to look like at that depth? 2 meters, maybe 2.5, she said. We navigate by feel and bearing. No lights, no active sonar, pure dead reckoning. Harlow looked at the diagram for another moment. Then he looked up at her. You've done this before, he said. Not a question, she met his eyes. I've navigated worse. He nodded once, slowly, with a deliberateness that meant he was making a decision about something larger than the tactical question. All right, he said, I'm in Torres, and the fourth operator, a former Marine raider named Okafor, looked at each other. Okafor shrugged. If she's wrong, we lose the evolution, he said. If she's right, we win it. Those odds are fine with me. Mercer said nothing. He was already in. Had been in since the briefing room. They hit the water at 01:15. The temperature was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. In a dry suit with full equipment, 54 degrees was manageable. Without the suit, it would have been dangerous in under 20 minutes. The waves at the surface were running consistent with the forecast, 3 to 4 feet, which meant the transition from the insertion point to the underwater navigation phase was uncomfortable and physically demanding before the real work even started. Maya went first. She always went first. She had learned that in circumstances of genuine uncertainty, the person who had designed the approach needed to be the person who executed the first contact with reality. Because reality never matched the plan exactly. And the first contact point was where the adjustments happened. And the adjustments needed to be made by someone who understood the complete architecture of the plan well enough to adapt it without losing its essential shape. The underwater approach to the dead zone took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of cold and dark, and the particular kind of silence that exists underwater, where the only sound is your own breathing, and the mechanical noise of your equipment, and the low-frequency thrum of the ocean doing what the ocean does regardless of what human beings want from it. 11 minutes of navigating by compass bearing and elapsed time and the sensory reading of a current that she had modeled in her head from the storm track data and the platform engineering report. At the 9-minute mark, she felt the current shift. It was subtle. A change in pressure and direction that most people would not have distinguished from normal variation. She felt it, and she adjusted her bearing by 4 degrees, and she held the adjustment for the remaining 2 minutes until the platform structure appeared as a darker mass against the dark water around them. The dead zone was exactly where she had calculated it would be. 4 meters. She moved through it in single file with her team behind her, and the sensors above them registered nothing. And the opposing force in the platform operations deck had no indication that anyone was in the water anywhere near the northwestern quadrant, because their threat model did not include the northwestern quadrant as a viable approach vector. Inside the platform, the environment shifted from cold and wet to dark and industrial. She navigated by memory and by the structural logic of how these platforms were built, because once you understood the engineering principles that governed a class of structure, you could move through any member of that class with reasonable confidence, even if you had never been inside that specific one. She had studied the platform's engineering specifications. She knew where the operations deck was relative to the access points. She knew the most efficient path to it. She also knew that Bennett's team would be following the standard approach, which meant they would be triggering sensors, which meant the opposing force would be repositioning to respond to Bennett's team, which meant the operations deck would be precisely under-defended. She timed it. At the 18-minute mark from her water entry, she put her team on the operations deck. Bennett's team was still in the water. The simulated hostage package was in a locked container in the center of the operations deck. The opposing force had left one defender on the deck, the rest having repositioned to respond to Bennett's approach. Maya took the single defender out of play with a simulated contact that the evaluation system recorded in less than 4 seconds. She secured the container. She signaled extraction. Then she waited. She waited because she wanted it to be clear. Not just in the data, in the experience of everyone present. In the moment of recognition that happened, when Bennett's team finally breached the operations deck from the primary access point, breathing hard from a water insertion that had gone as planned for them, except for the one crucial detail that they were arriving several minutes too late, and they found Maya Caldwell standing in the center of the operations deck with the package already secured and her team already positioned, and the only question remaining being whether they understood what had happened. Bennett looked at her, she looked at him. How, he said. Not angrily. That was the remarkable thing. He said it the way a man says something, when the answer has just rewritten a significant portion of what he believed to be true. How did you get here? Northwestern approach, she said. There's a sensor grid on the northwestern quadrant. There's a gap in the sensor grid on the northwestern quadrant. 4 meters. It's been there for 8 months. It's in the platform engineering data. He stared at her. His team was behind him, and they were staring too, and the evaluation observers positioned around the deck were recording everything, and in one of the observation posts 15 yards away, Commander Whitmore was looking at his evaluation tablet with an expression that had moved well past professional neutrality. You found that in the engineering data, Bennett said.
Yes.
The publicly available engineering data.
Yes.
He was quiet for a long moment. Then we had access to the same data. Yes, she said. You did. He looked at the secured package. He looked at his team. He looked at the evaluation observers. Then he looked back at Maya, and something happened in his face that she had not expected to see there. It was not defeat exactly. It was something that sits next to defeat when a person of genuine character encounters an outcome that contradicts their fundamental assumptions. Something that starts to look in the right light, like recognition. He said nothing else. He stepped back. He let his team stand down. The evaluation recording would show a result that Whitmore transmitted to Cross's office at 0300. Cross was not asleep. He had not been sleeping well for 3 days, though he had not examined that fact closely enough to understand why. He read the evaluation summary at his desk, and he sat with it for a long time. Maya's team, Northwestern approach, sensor gap exploitation. Package secured before primary team breached primary access point. He read it 3 times, then he opened a separate file. A file that existed in a secure partition on his personal device that he had accessed perhaps a dozen times in 7 years, always late at night, always when something triggered the memory in a way he could not suppress. It was not an official file. It was a personal reconstruction. Notes he had made over the years from fragments of memory and fragments of officially released information and the things the other 5 survivors had told him in private conversations over the years. The Afghanistan operation. 6 men trapped, communications dark. Extraction window extended, 12 hours of waiting. And then something that none of them could fully explain even 7 years later. A single operative, moving through terrain that the enemy controlled, finding the gaps in the coverage the same way someone found gaps in a sensor grid. Using information in environmental reading and a quality of spatial intelligence that none of them had ever seen in another person. Bringing them home. Cross stared at the evaluation summary. He thought about the northwestern quadrant. He thought about the gap in the sensor grid. He thought about publicly available engineering data and the kind of mind that thought to cross-reference it with storm track reports to calculate a dead zone that nobody else on the training staff had identified. He closed the Afghanistan file. He sat very still for a long time. Then he did something that was either an act of denial or an act of self-preservation, and the line between those two things had never been very clear to him. He picked up the phone and called Bennett. Bennett answered on the second ring. "Tomorrow morning," Cross said. "I want you to make it personal." A pause on the line. "Define personal, Admiral. I want her off balance. I want her reacting instead of planning. I want her making decisions from emotion rather than calculation." His voice was level. "Professional, find the angle." Another pause, longer this time. Then Bennett said, "She doesn't seem to have many angles." "Everyone has angles," Cross said. "Find it." He ended the call. Bennett sat in the dark of the barracks for a long time after that. He was thinking about the operations deck, about the package already secured, about the 4-meter gap in a sensor grid that she had found in publicly available data that he had not thought to read. He was thinking about the vest and the title variants and the briefing room and every other moment in the past 3 weeks where his model of who Maya Caldwell was had been contradicted by what Maya Caldwell actually did. He was thinking about the word personal. He was thinking about what he was being asked to do and why. And somewhere in that thinking, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way he could fully name yet. But something that had been solid in his understanding of this situation became slightly less solid. And the thing that made it less solid was the simple, inconvenient fact that he could not find a single piece of genuine evidence that Maya Caldwell had done anything other than exactly what she was supposed to do. Every argument he had made against her was built on what he could not verify, on what was not in her visible record, on the absence of something. Not on the presence of anything wrong. He lay down on his bunk. He did not sleep for a long time. The next morning came at 05:30 with the standard noise of a training barracks returning to operational tempo. Maya was already up. She had been up since 0400, running her tactical review the way she always ran it, which was to say entirely inside her own head, sitting on the edge of her bunk with her eyes open and her mind working through every variable in the environment around her. She knew Cross had made a call after the evaluation results came in. She knew it not because she had access to his communications, but because she understood how men like Cross operated. They did not accept contradiction without responding to it. The evaluation result was a contradiction. The response was coming. She was ready for it. What she was not ready for was Mercer knocking on the frame of her bunk space at 05:45 with a look on his face that she had not seen from him before. "Someone talked to the training cadre," he said quietly. Last night after the evaluation, she looked at him. "What did they say?" "That your Afghanistan service record has irregularities. That there are questions about whether certain operations you've cited for qualification purposes actually occurred in the form documented." Maya was very still for a moment. "Then who talked to the cadre?" "I don't know for certain," Mercer said, "but Bennett got a call after midnight." She processed that the call, the timing, the specific nature of the accusation, not her performance, not her results, but her record. The one thing she could not defend publicly because the defense required disclosure that she was not authorized to make. "They're not attacking your ability anymore," Mercer said. "They're attacking your integrity." "Yes," she said. "That's a different kind of fight." "Yes," she said again. He looked at her for a moment. "Can you prove they're wrong?" She looked at him steadily. "I can prove everything."
At the right time.
"In the right place." "When is the right time?" She thought about the graduation ceremony, about the call sign tradition, about the specific moment she had been building towards since the first morning of this program. The moment she had understood was coming from the day the assignment appeared in her operational brief, the moment that would make everything visible in a way that could not be denied or reclassified or buried under institutional pressure. "Soon," she said. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. He was making another decision. She could see him making it. The same kind of decision he had been making in increments since the tidal variance question in the briefing room, each one building on the last, each one requiring him to extend a degree of trust that his training told him to withhold from unverified sources. He extended it anyway. All right, he said, what do you need from me? She looked at him. And for the first time since she had arrived at this program, something in her expression moved away from the controlled professional neutrality she maintained as a matter of operational habit. Something that was not quite vulnerability, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and had just encountered, unexpectedly, someone offering to help carry it. Just keep paying attention, she said. And when the moment comes, remember everything you've seen. He nodded. She stood up and began preparing for the morning evolution. Across the barracks, Bennett lay on his bunk, looking at the ceiling, and the thing that had become slightly less solid in him in the dark of last night was becoming less solid still in the light of morning, and he was not yet sure what to do with that. And in his office, Admiral Nathaniel Cross was looking at a file he had not intended to open again. The Afghanistan file, the reconstruction, the fragments. He was looking at one line in particular, a line from one of the other survivors, a man named Kowalski who had said it in a private conversation 4 years ago over drinks that Cross had agreed to consider off the record. Kowalski had said, I never saw her face. It was too dark and we were in too bad a shape. But I remember her hands. She had these very steady hands. Even when she was half carrying Reyes up that last ridge, her hands were completely steady. Steady hands. Cross stared at that line. He thought about the northwestern quadrant. He thought about the dead zone. He thought about a woman who had adjusted her bearing by 4 degrees in the dark underwater because she felt the current change, and he thought about whether that was the kind of thing a person could learn in a classroom, or whether that was the kind of thing that lived in a body that had navigated genuinely impossible terrain in genuinely impossible conditions and survived. He closed the file again, but this time his hands were not entirely steady. The integrity accusation hit the training cadre at 0600, delivered through official channels with the kind of paperwork that suggested it had been prepared before the maritime evaluation results even came in. Commander Whitmore found it on his desk when he arrived, a formal inquiry request citing unspecified irregularities in Lieutenant Commander Maya Caldwell's operational service documentation, requesting a review of her qualification records before she was permitted to continue in the advanced program. He read it twice, then he sat down, then he read it a third time. He had been in naval special warfare for 19 years. He knew what a legitimate inquiry looked like. He also knew what a manufactured one looked like. The difference was in the details, specifically in the absence of them. A legitimate inquiry cited specific discrepancies. It named the records in question, the dates involved, the specific claims that could not be verified. This inquiry cited nothing specific. It referenced irregularities in general terms, the kind of language that created the appearance of a substantive concern without providing anything that could actually be investigated or resolved. It was designed to delay, to create uncertainty, to shift the narrative from what Maya had accomplished in the maritime evaluation to whether she was qualified to be in the program at all. Whitmore picked up his phone. He called the officer who had signed the inquiry. The call went to voicemail. He called the administrative office that had processed it. They confirmed it had been submitted through proper channels. They could not tell him who had initiated it above the signing officer. He put the phone down. He thought about the northwestern quadrant for the 4th time since 0300. Then he did something that was either the bravest or the most professionally dangerous thing he had done in 19 years. He picked the inquiry up, walked to his filing cabinet, placed it in a pending folder, and wrote on the folder tab in his own handwriting, insufficient specificity for action. Review suspended pending supplemental documentation. He closed the cabinet. He went to run the morning evolution. Maya knew about the inquiry by 0645, Mercer told her. He had heard it from Torres, who had overheard a conversation between two members of the training cadre who had not careful enough about where they were having it. The information moved through the training class the way information always moved in closed environments, fast and with accretion, picking up details and interpretations as it traveled until by 0700 a version of it had reached Bennett's ears that included the word fraud, which was not a word that had appeared in the original document. Bennett heard the word fraud and felt something uncomfortable happen in his chest, because he had been the one who received Cross's call. He had been the one asked to find the angle, and the angle that had been found, the integrity attack, the record irregularities, the challenge to her qualification history had not been found by him. It had arrived fully formed in official paperwork signed by someone else, which meant the machinery had been in motion before Cross ever called him. Which meant Cross had made the call not to initiate something, but to make sure Bennett was aligned with something already initiated. Bennett stood in the corridor outside the equipment room and thought about that for a long moment. The word fraud sat in his head, and it did not sit comfortably. He thought about the maritime evaluation, the 4-meter gap, the publicly available data. He thought about the vest and the title variance and every other moment where she had done something that a person who had fraudulently obtained her position could not possibly have done. He thought about her voice when she said to him, "You had access to the same data." He thought about what fraud actually meant. Then he went looking for Mercer. He found him at the equipment station, same place as always, maintaining gear with the focused deliberateness of a man who does things correctly the first time because he understands the cost of doing them wrong. Bennett pulled up beside him and kept his voice low. "The inquiry," he said. Mercer looked at him sideways. "What about it? I need to know if you think it's legitimate." Mercer set down the equipment he was holding. He turned and looked at Bennett directly. "Do you think it's legitimate?" A pause. Bennett's jaw worked slightly. "No," he said, "I don't." Mercer held his gaze. "Then why are you asking me?" "Because I made a call to Cross last night," Bennett said. "After the evaluation, he told me to make it personal. I didn't know what that meant until this morning." He paused. "I need you to understand that I did not know about the inquiry." Mercer studied him for a moment, reading him the way operators read things, looking for the tells that distinguish genuine uncertainty from performed uncertainty. He found genuine. "What are you going to do about it?" Mercer said. Bennett was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I need to know one thing." He looked directly at Mercer. "Do you believe she's real? Not the performance, not the tactics. Do you believe she's carrying something actual?" Mercer picked up his equipment again. He checked the connector with his thumb. Then he said, without looking up, "I believe she's carrying something most of us couldn't lift." Bennett nodded slowly. He walked away. Mercer watched him go and thought, something just changed. He was not sure yet whether it had changed enough. But something had. Maya was told about the fraud word at 0730 by Torres, who delivered it quietly and with genuine discomfort on his face, the discomfort of a man reporting information he wishes he did not have to report. She received it without visible reaction. She thanked him. She went back to her equipment check, and something was running very fast. She had anticipated the integrity attack. She had not anticipated the speed of it or the specific language. Fraud was a precise escalation, a word chosen to trigger a specific institutional response. In the naval special warfare community, a fraud allegation against an operator's service record was not a minor administrative matter. It was the kind of allegation that, if it gained traction, could result in immediate suspension from a program pending investigation, and an investigation of classified records was a process that could take weeks or months, which was precisely the point. Cross was not trying to beat her in an evolution anymore. He was trying to remove her from the board entirely. She thought about her options. She could contact Rear Admiral Sarah Bennett directly and request acceleration of the timeline. That option existed. It was clean and it was fast and it would resolve the immediate threat. It would also expose the investigation prematurely, before the evidence was fully assembled, before the moment she had been building toward arrived at the right time, in the right place with the right people present. She ran the calculations she decided to hold. Because she understood something about timing that Cross did not understand about her, which was that she had spent years learning to hold positions that felt untenable until the moment when holding became advantage. This felt untenable. It was not. The inquiry was sitting in Whitmore's pending file with an annotation about insufficient specificity. She knew that because she knew Whitmore, not personally, but professionally, through the assessment she had built of him over 5 weeks, of watching him navigate the gap between his institutional obligations and his personal integrity. He was a good officer in an uncomfortable position, and he was doing what good officers do in uncomfortable positions, which was buy time. She was going to use that time. At 0900, the morning evolution began. Combat decision-making under simulated stress. Each operator faced a series of escalating tactical scenarios presented in real time, requiring immediate decisions with incomplete information. The scenarios were timed. The decisions were recorded. The quality of the decision was evaluated not just on outcome, but on the reasoning process that led to it, which the operators articulated verbally as they worked through each scenario. It was structurally the evolution most likely to expose the difference between operators who had real high-pressure decision-making experience and operators who had trained for it. Training produced good decisions when the scenario matched the training model. Experience produced good decisions when the scenario diverged from anything you had prepared for. The 15th scenario was one nobody in the room had seen in any training context. A team of 6 is in a compromised position. Communications are dark. The extraction window has been extended by command decision beyond safe parameters. The enemy advances faster than projected. The team has 2 viable options. Option A follows the protocol, holds the current position, waits for the extended extraction window, and accepts the risk that the enemy advance will close the position before extraction arrives. Option B breaks protocol, initiates unauthorized movement, and attempts self-extraction through terrain that has not been cleared. Maya read it. She did not move for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time in a timed scenario. Then she picked up the response instrument and began speaking. Option B, she said, initiating unauthorized movement. Rationale protocol exists to maximize the probability of mission success under standard conditions. When conditions diverge sufficiently from standard, protocol becomes a liability rather than an asset. The command decision to extend the extraction window was made with incomplete situational awareness. The team on the ground has better information than the command element. Acting on superior information, even when that action violates protocol, is the correct decision when the alternative is accepting a failure outcome that the protocol was designed to prevent. She paused. Then she added, document the decision. Accept the accountability. Bring your people home. The room was quiet after she finished. Whitmore, who was running the evaluation, wrote something on his tablet. His face did not change, but his pen moved for longer than it had moved after any previous response. Afterward, Torres found her in the corridor. Scenario 15, he said. That felt real. She looked at him. It was based on a real event. He blinked. How do you know? Because I lived it, she said. She kept walking. Torres stood in the corridor and replayed those 4 words in his head. Because I lived it, not because I studied it, not because I read about it. Because I lived it. He thought about what that meant, about what kind of real event scenario 15 was based on, about 6 men in a compromised position with communications dark and an extraction window that had been extended by command decision. He started doing math in his head. He did not like where the math was taking him. At 1400, Cross summoned Whitmore. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Maya knew the duration because Mercer had positioned himself in a location that allowed him to note the timing without being obvious about it, and he reported back to her afterward with the precision of someone who understood that duration was data. 11 minutes. Cross said what he said in 11 minutes, and Whitmore responded in 11 minutes, and one of those two men left that meeting with something he had not carried into it. Whitmore came back to the training facility and went directly to his office. He stayed there for 20 minutes. Then he came out and walked to where Maya was running equipment maintenance with her team. "Caldwell," he said, a word. She followed him to the edge of the facility, far enough from the others for the conversation to be private. He looked at her directly. He was a man who looked at things directly when they mattered. "The inquiry is going to be escalated," he said. "I held it as long as I could. Cross wants it processed formally. That means a formal review process, and under the review process, you would be suspended from active hind training evolutions pending the outcome." Maya looked at him steadily. "How long does the review process take?" "Standard timeline is 4 to 6 weeks. She processed that. The graduation ceremony is in 9 days. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Commander Whitmore, if I told you that the inquiry is not a legitimate integrity concern but a tactical maneuver designed to remove me from the program before a specific scheduled event, would you understand what I was describing?" He held her gaze for a very long moment. "I would understand it," he said carefully. "I would also need to understand why a specific scheduled event would matter enough to someone to initiate an inquiry of this kind." She looked at him. She was making a calculation. The same kind she had been running since the first morning of this program, constantly revised as new data came in, constantly adjusted to account for variables she had not anticipated. She had not anticipated Whitmore. She had assessed him as a good officer in an uncomfortable position, which was accurate, but she had underestimated the degree to which a good officer in an uncomfortable position could become a genuine asset when the discomfort became acute enough. "The graduation ceremony," she said. "The call sign tradition." He frowned slightly. "What about it?" "There's a name," she said. "A name that is going to change everything in that room when it's spoken. And the person who most needs to not be in that room when it's spoken is the person driving this inquiry." Whitmore was very still. "Cross," he said. She said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that she had not expected, delivered in the quiet, precise tone of a man saying exactly what he means without decoration or equivocation. "I have 19 years in this community. I have seen good officers and bad officers and everything in between. And I have seen authority used correctly, and I have seen it used as a weapon." He paused. "What I'm looking at right now tells me which category this situation falls into." He walked back to his office. He picked up his phone. He called the administrative office that had processed the inquiry. He told them the review would proceed on a modified timeline due to operational continuity requirements, and that Lieutenant Commander Caldwell would remain in active training status pending the outcome of a preliminary assessment that he would conduct personally. He gave them a completion date for the preliminary assessment that was 12 days out. 3 days past the graduation ceremony. Then he put the phone down and sat with what he had just done. He had just put himself between a lieutenant commander and an admiral. In 19 years, he had never done anything like it. He thought about scenario 15. He thought about document the decision, accept the accountability, bring your people home. He thought, all right then. Cross found out about the modified timeline at 1600. The call he made to Whitmore's office afterward was the shortest conversation Whitmore had ever had with a superior officer. Cross said 4 sentences. Whitmore responded with 2. The call ended. Cross sat in his office and for the first time in this entire situation felt the thing he had been managing since 0300 that morning transform from manageable pressure into something with sharper edges. He was losing control of the sequence. He had designed the sequence carefully. The integrity attack was supposed to remove her from the program cleanly, through official channels, in a way that could not be attributed directly to him and could not be contested without the kind of disclosure that her classification level prevented. Whitmore had disrupted the sequence. The 12-day timeline disrupted the sequence. And Cross could not override the modification without making his involvement explicit in a way that would generate its own problems. He sat with that for a long time. Then he made a different decision. If she was going to be in the graduation ceremony, he was going to use the graduation ceremony. He had the authority to conduct the call sign presentations personally. He had always done them personally. It was one of the traditions he maintained as a point of institutional pride, the commanding admiral personally bestowing the operational name on each graduate, the name that would follow them through their career. He was going to use that moment. He was going to make it public, and he was going to make it final, and he was going to ask her, in front of every senior officer and military representative in that room, to justify her presence in the program. Not her record, her presence. The question she could not answer publicly without disclosure she was not authorized to make. He was going to win the ceremony, and whatever name she gave herself would look thin and inadequate in that room, next to the question he was going to ask. He did not know about the name she already had. The following 7 days moved with the peculiar compressed intensity of the final days before something that cannot be stopped. Evolutions continued. Performance continued. Maya continued to perform at a level that the evaluation data recorded without editorializing, numbers that sat in Whitmore's files and said what they said regardless of what anyone wanted them to say. Bennett said almost nothing during those 7 days. He showed up. He performed. He was present in every evolution and absent from every conversation he would previously have inserted himself into. Mercer noticed it. Torres noticed it. Even Harlow, the quiet Texan who observed more than he spoke, noticed that Bennett had gone from the loudest voice in the room to one of the quietest, and that the quality of his silence was not the silence of retreat, but the silence of someone working through something large. On the 5th day, Bennett found Maya alone in the equipment room at 2100. Most of the team had gone to the mess hall. She was doing what she often did when she thought no one was watching, which was working with her hands on something mechanical while her mind worked on something else entirely. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she acknowledged him. "Bennett," she said without looking up. "Caldwell, he came in." He stood a few feet away. He did not sit down. He had the posture of a man who has prepared what he wants to say and is checking it one more time before saying it. "I need to tell you something." She looked up then. "Cross called me the night after the maritime evaluation," he said. "He asked me to find an angle, something personal. Something to put you off balance." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that I did not produce the inquiry. I didn't know it was coming. But I want to be honest with you about the call, because I think you deserve to know the shape of what's been happening around you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I've spent 5 weeks building a case against you out of things I couldn't verify," he said. "And I've spent the last 7 days watching you do things I can verify. And the math doesn't add up in the direction I originally thought it did." She set down what she was working on. She gave him her full attention in a way that she did not give most people. He felt the weight of it. "You believed what you were told," she said. "About me, about why I was here, about what my record meant. You believed it because the available information supported it. That's not a character failure. That's a reasoning failure based on incomplete data." He stared at her. "I'm not angry at you," she said. "You were working with what you had." He exhaled. Something left his shoulders. "Who are you?" he said. And he meant it as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Not the provocative version he might have asked 5 weeks ago. The real version. She looked at him steadily. "I'm the person who's going to answer that question in 9 days," she said. In front of everyone, he held her gaze. Then he nodded. Once, with the same deliberateness that Harlow had used in the team briefing before the maritime exercise, the deliberateness of a man making a decision that has weight. "All right," he said. "Then I'll be there." He left. She turned back to what she was working on. Her hands were completely steady. 2 days before the graduation ceremony, Cross made one final move. He requested a personal meeting with the full training cadre to review graduation readiness assessments. Standard procedure. something he did before every graduation. Nobody found it unusual. In the meeting, he reviewed the performance data for all 24 operators. He commented on each one, positive, substantive, the comments of a commanding officer who understood the program and the people in it. When he reached Maya's file, he paused. Caldwell's numbers are strong, he said. Whitmore, sitting at the table, said nothing. However, Cross continued, there remain questions about her record that have not been formally resolved. I want to note for this group that the call sign ceremony is a tradition that carries the full weight of this community's values. Every name presented in that ceremony should represent verified excellence. He looked around the table. Verified, he said again. He was setting the stage. Every person in that room understood it. He was creating a context in which whatever happened at the ceremony would be filtered through the question of verification, in which her call sign, whatever she chose, would be heard in a room already primed to question its legitimacy. Whitmore waited until Cross finished. Then he said, the preliminary assessment of the record questions is complete. I found no substantive basis for the irregularity claims. He set a folder on the table. Caldwell's record is verified for program completion purposes. Cross looked at the folder, then at Whitmore. The room was very quiet. Commander Whitmore, Cross said. His voice was level. Professionally level. The kind of level that costs something. When did you complete that assessment? This morning, Admiral. And you're satisfied with the conclusion? I am. A pause, long enough for everyone at the table to feel it. Fine, Cross said. He moved to the next file. But his hands, Whitmore noticed, did not move with their usual certainty. They moved with something slightly less than that. Something that a person who was paying very close attention would recognize as the movement of a man who has just realized the ground beneath him is not as solid as he believed. That evening, Maya sat in the barracks long after the lights went down. She was not reviewing tactics. She was not running calculations. She was thinking about Afghanistan. She was thinking about 6 men who did not know her name when she found them, who would not have known her face even if it had been light enough to see it clearly, who had trusted her completely in the dark of those mountains because they had no other choice and because something in the way she moved and the way she decided and the way she held the weight of their survival on herself communicated something that did not require explanation. She was thinking about the one who had given her the name. He had said it as she helped him up the final ridge, barely conscious, one arm over her shoulders, his weight cutting into her. He had said it quietly, and she had not responded because there was no time to respond and because what he said was not a question. It was a recognition, Iron Widow. She had heard it and she had kept moving. She had brought all 6 of them across that ridge. She had handed them to the extraction team. She had walked back into the dark. Nobody official had seen her face. Nobody official had documented her name. The 6 men knew what they had seen, and the name they had given her had traveled quietly through the parts of the special operations community that dealt in real events rather than official records, spoken in the kind of conversations that happened between people who trusted each other completely, never loudly, never in documents. A ghost name, a legend with no face attached to it. Until now, she thought about Cross. She thought about him on that ridge, barely able to stand, one of the 6. She had been close enough to him to hear him breathing. She had made decisions in the dark that kept him alive. She had carried part of his weight up the last section of that ridge. And then she had spent 7 years watching him build his career on a version of that night that did not include her. Not out of malice. She believed that. She had chosen to believe it because the alternative that he knew and had chosen to erase her deliberately was a possibility she did not want to be true. What she believed was that he had buried it. The way people bury things they cannot explain or accept. The way people rewrite the memories that do not fit the story they need to tell about themselves. She believed he had buried her. And she believed that in 9 days, in a room full of the people who needed to know the truth, she was going to make him remember. She closed her eyes. The ceremony was 2 days away. And somewhere in this building, Nathaniel Cross was lying in the dark, with hands that were no longer entirely steady, thinking about a name he had told himself he had forgotten. Iron Widow. He had not forgotten. He had just been hoping for 7 years that he would never have to say it out loud. The morning of the graduation ceremony arrived, the way significant mornings always arrive, not with fanfare or announcement, but with the same ordinary noise of the world continuing to function while something irreversible prepared itself beneath the surface. 0530, lights, movement, the sounds of 24 operators moving through the final morning of a program that had cost each of them something real and given each of them something they could not have acquired any other way. Maya was already dressed when the lights came on. She had been sitting on the edge of her bunk since 0400, not reviewing tactics, not running calculations, simply sitting with the weight of what was coming in the particular way that she had learned to carry weight over the years. Fully, without deflection, without the comfortable fiction that the weight was smaller than it was. Today was going to be the hardest thing she had done since Afghanistan. Not because she was afraid of Cross. She had not been afraid of Cross since the first morning he stopped in front of her in that formation and asked whether she believed she belonged here. She had looked at him then, and she had seen a man who was operating from a version of his own history that had been carefully edited, and she had understood in that moment that the editing was not malicious. It was survival. People edited their histories to survive the gap between who they needed to believe they were and what they had actually done. What she was afraid of, if she was honest with herself in the dark of 0400, was the moment after. Not the revelation she had planned for. The moment after was the one she could not fully control, the one where the room reacted to what they had heard, where Cross processed what she had said in front of everyone, where the 7 years of carefully maintained institutional distance between what had happened in Afghanistan and what had been officially recorded collapsed into a single present tense moment that could not be taken back or reclassified. She had done things she could not undo before. She had done them deliberately, and she had accepted the consequences, and she had kept moving. This was the same. She told herself it was the same. It was not entirely the same, because this time the consequence would land on someone else as much as on herself, and the someone else was a man she had once carried up a ridge in the dark, and whatever his failures had been in the years since, she had not forgotten the sound of his breathing on that ridge. The sound of someone trying to stay alive. She carried that with her into the morning. At 0700, Mercer found her in the corridor outside the mess hall. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for the past several days, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who has revised their understanding of a situation so completely that they are still integrating the revision. "How are you doing?" he said. It was a simple question. The kind people ask each other in the morning. But from Mercer, in this context, on this morning, it carried the weight of 5 weeks of watching and revising and deciding, and she received it as what it was. "I'm ready," she said. He nodded. "Bennett is going to be in the front row. He told me last night. He said he wants to see the whole thing." She looked at him. "He's changed." "Yes," Mercer said. "I think he has a pause. I think a lot of things have changed in this program." "I think that was the point." She looked at him steadily. "Not entirely," she said. "The point was the truth. The change was a consequence. He accepted that. Then he said, whatever happens in that room today, I want you to know that I've seen what I've seen. And nothing that happens in that room is going to revise what I've seen." She looked at him for a long moment. The expression that moved across her face was the same one he had seen briefly before the maritime exercise, the one that lived adjacent to vulnerability without quite being it. The expression of someone who had been carrying something alone for so long that an unexpected offer of accompaniment registered as something almost physical. "Thank you, Ryan," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He straightened slightly. "Not much, just enough." They went to breakfast. At 0900, a vehicle arrived at the Naval Special Warfare Center that was not on the standard arrival schedule for the day. It was an unmarked government vehicle, the kind that the people who knew what it represented recognized immediately, and the people who did not know simply filed as administrative traffic. It parked near the administrative building. Two people got out. One of them was a woman in a Navy uniform carrying the rank of Rear Admiral. She walked with the deliberate pace of someone who had somewhere specific to be and was arriving at exactly the time she had planned to arrive. Her name was Sarah Bennett, not Cole Bennett, Sarah Bennett, a different one entirely. Rear Admiral Sarah Bennett, Naval Intelligence, who had been Maya's operational liaison for the past 3 years and who had driven the 7-year investigation that had finally, carefully, with the kind of patience that only people who deal in classified information for a living can sustain, produced the complete picture of what had gone wrong in Afghanistan. She went directly to Whitmore's office. Whitmore opened the door before she knocked. He had been expecting her, not by name. Maya had told him that morning, at 06:30, that someone important would be arriving before the ceremony and that Whitmore should make sure they had access to whatever they needed. She had not told him who. She had not told him why. She had looked at him with the steady gaze she used when she needed someone to trust her without complete information. And Whitmore had looked back at her with the gaze of a man who had made his decision 2 days ago in a meeting room when he put his preliminary assessment folder on the table and said, "All right." Sarah Bennett sat across from Whitmore and opened a briefing folder that she placed between them on his desk. "What I'm going to share with you," she said, "is partially classified and partially not. The portions that are not classified will become relevant in approximately 4 hours. The portions that are classified I'm sharing with you on an eyes-only basis because you are the commanding officer of this facility, and what happens here today is going to require your support to proceed correctly." Whitmore looked at the folder. "Does Admiral Cross know you're here?" "No," she said. He looked up at her. "Admiral Cross," she said evenly, "is a subject of the investigation I'm going to brief you on. Not as a primary actor, as a contributing factor whose contribution has significant institutional implications." She paused. "He does not know the investigation exists. He does not know that the assignment of Lieutenant Commander Caldwell to this program was part of the investigative architecture. And he does not know what is going to happen in that ceremony room this afternoon." Whitmore sat very still. "What is going to happen in that ceremony room this afternoon?" Rear Admiral Bennett looked at him. "A 7-year truth is going to come out," she said. "And you are going to make sure it comes out in a room where the right people can hear it." He looked at the folder for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me everything." She did. It took 47 minutes. At the end of those 47 minutes, Whitmore stood up from his desk and walked to his window and stood there for a moment with his back to her. Then he turned around. "The intelligence failure," he said. "The one that exposed the Afghanistan team. You have the source." "We have the source," she confirmed, "and we have the chain. All the way up to the decision level that extended the extraction window. And the decision level is senior command," she said. "Multiple failures at multiple levels, not deliberate betrayal. Something arguably worse. Negligence compounded by institutional self-protection. People who made bad decisions and then spent years ensuring the record of those decisions stayed buried." Whitmore thought about scenario 15, about the correct answer Maya had given, about protocol becoming a liability when conditions diverge sufficiently from standard, about document the decision, accept the accountability, bring your people home. She built the answer from her own experience, he said. Scenario 15. Rear Admiral Bennett looked at him. She built everything in this program from her own experience. The maritime evaluation, the briefing room, all of it. She paused. She has been here for 6 weeks doing 2 things simultaneously. One of them is performing at the level you have observed. The other is completing the final stage of an investigation that needed to conclude in this specific environment because the final piece of evidence is here. Cross, Whitmore said. His reaction, she said, when he hears the name in front of witnesses, in a room where denial is not operationally viable. She met his eyes. A man who truly had no knowledge of Iron Widow's identity would react one way. A man who is known or suspected and buried it will react a different way. The difference is observable, and it is documentable, and it is the final piece. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that had nothing to do with strategy or investigation or institutional procedure. He said it in the voice of a man who has just understood something human. She saved him, he said, and he spent 7 years making sure she couldn't prove it. Rear Admiral Bennett said nothing. She did not need to. At 1100, the operators began assembling for the pre-ceremony preparation. Dress uniforms, final equipment checks, the particular combination of exhaustion and pride that marks the end of something that required everything you had. They moved through the preparation with the efficiency of people who had been trained to do everything efficiently, including the things that were not tactical. Bennett found a moment to stand near Maya during the uniform check. He did not say anything at first. He just stood close enough that the proximity was intentional. Then he said quietly, "I've been thinking about the vest." She looked at him sideways. "I didn't modify it," he said. "I want to be clear about that, but I knew who did. And I didn't say anything." He paused. "I told myself it was because I believed you were here for the wrong reasons. But the real reason was simpler than that. I wanted you to have a visible failure that I could point to." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because today feels like the kind of day when the incomplete versions of things shouldn't be left incomplete," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Who modified the vest?" He told her she filed the name, not for retribution, for the record. Because the record needed to be complete, and incomplete records were exactly the kind of thing that allowed bad decisions to compound across years into the kind of institutional failure that left 6 people trapped in Afghanistan with communications dark. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "For what it's worth, Caldwell. I would follow you." If it came to that, he paused. "I think most of them would." She looked at the room full of operators preparing for the ceremony. Mercer, Torres, Harlow, Okafor. Men who had started this program with a fixed opinion of her and had revised that opinion through direct observation over 6 weeks. Men who had watched her perform and adapt and hold under pressure and decline to retaliate when retaliation would have been both justified and easy. "It's worth something," she said. At 1300, the ceremony room filled. It was the largest formal space on the base, and it was full in a way that formal spaces rarely are when the content being presented is purely procedural. Senior officers from multiple commands, military representatives from Joint Special Operations Divisions, several people whose institutional affiliations were not displayed on their uniforms. And in a seat near the back, positioned with the quiet specificity of someone who had chosen that location deliberately, Rear Admiral Sarah Bennett. Cross was on the stage. He looked exactly as he always looked. 61 years old, carrying 35 years of institutional authority in the way he occupied space. His uniform was perfect. His bearing was perfect. His face was the face of a man who believed he was about to conduct a ceremony that would end the way he had designed it to end. He did not see Rear Admiral Bennett in the back of the room. His sight line from the stage did not reach that far with clarity, and she had positioned herself in a way that used the crowd effectively. He did not notice Whitmore's posture, which was slightly different from its usual presentation, carrying something that Cross, if he had been looking for it, would have recognized as the posture of a man who knows more than he is showing. Cross was not looking for it. He was looking at Maya Caldwell, standing at the back of the operator formation, and he was thinking about the question he was going to ask her, and he was feeling the particular confidence of a man who believes the board is arranged in his favor. The ceremony began at 13:15. Cross moved through the operators with the practiced ease of a man performing a tradition he had performed many times. Each operator stepped forward. Cross spoke briefly about their performance. He bestowed the call sign. The room responded with the particular kind of approval that comes from watching the right ritual performed correctly. Falcon, for an operator whose precision targeting had been the standout metric of the program. Sentinel, for a man whose situational awareness had saved his team 3 times in 3 different evolutions. Viper, for Bennett, which produced a moment of laughter from the room that was genuine and warm, and which Bennett received with a half smile that was different from the smiles he had worn in the first weeks of the program. Smaller, more real. When he returned to formation and passed Maya, he gave her a single nod. She returned it. One by one, the room filled with names. Each one a small ceremony inside the larger one. Each one a moment of recognition that the person standing in front of the Admiral had done something genuine and had earned the right to carry a name that represented it. Then there was one operator left. Maya Caldwell stepped forward. The room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but the quality of the silence changed, the way silence changes when a room full of people who have been following a narrative for weeks recognize that the narrative has arrived at its decisive moment. They did not all know why they felt it, but they felt it. Cross looked at her. He had been waiting for this moment for 6 weeks. He had built toward it through the integrity inquiry and the record challenge and every evolution he had designed or modified to produce a public failure. He had arrived at this moment believing it belonged to him. He smiled, not warmly, the smile of a man about to make a point. "Lieutenant Commander Maya Caldwell," he said. His voice carried through the room with the ease of 35 years of command presence. "Before we proceed to your call sign, I'd like to take a moment." The room was very quiet. "This program is built on verification," he said. "On the principle that every operator who stands in this room has earned their place through demonstrated excellence that the community can verify, recognize, and trust." He looked at her directly. "Some of the records supporting your place here have raised questions during this program. Questions that have not been fully resolved to my satisfaction." He paused. "Let it land. So I'd like to give you the opportunity in front of this community to tell us what makes you worthy of a call sign." In your own words. The room held its breath. It was the most publicly naked use of authority that most of the people present had witnessed in their careers. Not illegal, not technically improper, but unmistakable in its intention. He was asking her to justify herself in a room where she could not produce the evidence that would justify her without disclosing information she was not authorized to disclose. He had designed it perfectly, except for one thing. He had designed it without knowing what name she was about to say. Maya accepted the ceremonial glass that was part of the tradition. She held it. She looked at Cross with the same steady gaze she had used on him since the first morning. Then she looked at the room, and something shifted in her expression. Not the controlled professional neutrality, not the adjacent to vulnerability look she had shown Mercer in private. Something else, something that belonged to a person who has been carrying a truth for 7 years and has finally arrived at the exact moment and the exact place and the exact audience where the truth can be spoken completely and received fully. She looked back at Cross. "My call sign," she said, "is Iron Widow." 2 words. They landed in that room like a physical thing. Cross heard them, and something happened to him that had never happened to him on a stage in 35 years of public command. His body responded before his mind caught up. His hand released the glass. It was not a choice. It was the involuntary response of a nervous system that had just been delivered a shock it had spent 7 years preparing to never receive. The glass fell. It shattered on the stage. The sound of it breaking was the loudest thing in the room. Cross stared at her. His face had gone through 3 separate expressions in less than 2 seconds and had arrived at something that was not one of his usual ones. Something that was too raw for his training to suppress in real time. "No," he said. The word came out of him like something pulled. "That's not possible." Maya looked at him steadily. 7 years ago," she said. Her voice was calm, clear. The voice of someone delivering a report from a position of complete information. In northern Afghanistan, Kandahar province, a 6-man SEAL team was compromised by an intelligence failure that exposed their position to hostile forces. Communications went dark. The extraction window was extended by command decision beyond safe parameters. She paused. The team held for 12 hours while the enemy advance closed their position. The room was not breathing. You were the team leader, she said. You were the first one I found when I came in. Another pause. You were the last one up the final ridge because your left knee had been damaged in the third hour and you could not bear full weight. I carried part of that weight for the last 400 meters. Cross's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The rescue was classified at the highest level immediately after extraction, she continued. The operative who conducted it was listed as unidentified in the official record to protect the operational security of an ongoing asset network. She looked at him with something that was not anger and was not triumph and was not satisfaction. It was something quieter and harder than all of those things. The 6 men who came home knew who I was. They gave me a name. She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Iron Widow, she said. Cross made a sound that was not a word. His hand went to the edge of the podium. He gripped it, the grip of a man using something solid to stay connected to the physical world while the world reorganized itself around him. In the back of the room, Rear Admiral Sarah Bennett stood up. Every head turned. She walked to the front of the room with the unhurried pace of someone executing a plan that has been running for 7 years and has just arrived at its conclusion. She was in full dress uniform. Her rank was unmistakable. She stopped at the edge of the stage and addressed the room. My name is Rear Admiral Sarah Bennett, Naval Intelligence. I am the senior officer responsible for the Afghanistan operation investigation that has been running for the past 7 years. Her voice was clear and even, and carried the particular quality of someone accustomed to delivering significant information in high-stakes environments. Lieutenant Commander Caldwell's assignment to this program was the final phase of that investigation. Her presence here was not a political decision or an institutional experiment. It was an operational requirement. The room was completely still. The investigation, she continued, has produced a complete picture of the intelligence failure that compromised the Afghanistan team. The failure originated at multiple levels of senior command and was compounded by subsequent decisions to contain the documentation of what occurred rather than address it through proper accountability channels. She paused. The operative who conducted the rescue, whose identity has been classified for 7 years, was Lieutenant Commander Maya Caldwell. The call sign Iron Widow was assigned by the surviving team members and has existed in the operational record as an unidentified designation since the night of the rescue. She looked at Cross. He was still gripping the podium. Admiral Cross, she said, her tone did not change. You are not being accused of deliberate betrayal. The investigation has concluded that your role in the intelligence failure was one of negligence rather than intent. However, your subsequent actions in this program, which have been fully documented, constitute a pattern of conduct toward Lieutenant Commander Caldwell that the investigation considers relevant to the broader accountability question. The room processed that. Cross looked at Maya. She looked back at him. And for the first time, something happened that nobody in the room had expected. Because Cross, 61 years old, 35 years of command, more medals than most people would see in a lifetime, looked at the woman standing in front of him, and his face did something that his face was not constructed to do. It cracked, not theatrically, not dramatically, the way real things crack. Quietly, in the specific location where the pressure has been greatest for the longest time. You carried me, he said, and it came out in a voice that had none of the command authority in it. A voice stripped down to something underneath the rank and the uniform and the 35 years. 400 meters. Yes, she said. I never knew. His grip on the podium loosened. I told myself I never knew. I told myself the investigation never identified anyone. His voice dropped further. I told myself that was true. She looked at him. Was it? A long silence, he said. It cost him something enormous to say it. The kind of something that cannot be borrowed or deferred. There was a briefing. 3 years after, someone in intelligence mentioned a female operative. An asset network connection. I told myself it wasn't relevant. I told myself the connection was too thin. He stopped. I didn't want it to be relevant. The room heard every word. Mercer, standing in the operator formation, felt something move through him that he could not have named precisely. It was not pity, it was not satisfaction. It was the particular feeling that arrives when you watch a human being face something they have been running from for a very long time, and the facing is more complicated and more painful than any simple narrative of guilt or innocence can hold. Torres beside him was very still. Harlow at the end of the row was looking at the floor. Then he looked up at Maya and nodded. Bennett was looking at his hands. Then he raised his head and looked directly at Maya, and his expression was one she had not seen from him before. It was the expression of a man who has been wrong in a way that matters and knows it, and is not trying to construct a smaller version of the wrongness to make it more manageable. Cross said, "I questioned whether you belonged here." His voice was barely carrying now. "From the first day. I built a case against you that I built on nothing real, because somewhere underneath a part of me that was doing that, some part of me already knew." "What did you know?" she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. "That you were better than me," he said, "at the thing that matters most. The thing you can't rank or decorate or put in a record." He let go of the podium. "I knew what you were, and I was afraid of what it meant." The room was completely silent. Rear Admiral Bennett looked at Whitmore. He looked back at her. Something passed between them that was not a word. Then Cross did something that nobody in that room had expected from him. He stepped back from the podium. He straightened. He looked at Maya with the eyes of a man who has put down something he has been carrying for 7 years, and the putting down has not made him lighter. It has made him emptier, but emptier is honest, and honest was something he had not fully been for a very long time. He said Iron Widow, not as a question, not as a ceremony, as a recognition. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. Then he reached into his uniform pocket and produced a small insignia. The Iron Widow designation, rendered in the official format of a Naval Special Warfare call sign marker, on a backing that indicated it had been prepared in advance and had been waiting in his pocket since before the ceremony began. The room saw it and understood simultaneously that Rear Admiral Bennett had prepared it and given it to Cross before the ceremony, that this had been part of the architecture from the beginning, that Cross having it in his pocket was not coincidence but design, that the design had been built by Maya and Bennett over 7 years, and had been intended from the start to arrive at exactly this moment, in exactly this room, with exactly this man holding the insignia. Cross held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment. And she took it. The room erupted, not with the polite approval of a standard ceremony moment, with something that had no standard ceremony equivalent. The sound of 24 operators and a room full of senior officers processing a revelation that had reorganized their understanding of who they were looking at and why it mattered. The sound of something that had been wrong for 7 years beginning in this moment to be corrected. Mercer started it. He put his hands together, and the sound of it was the first sound in the room, and it was followed immediately by Torres and Harlow and Okafor, and then Cole Bennett, who stood and put his hands together with the force of a man who is making a statement rather than following a crowd. Then everyone else. Maya stood on the stage with the Iron Widow insignia in her hand, and she looked at the room and she let herself feel it. All of it. The weight of 7 years, the weight of the 6 men on that ridge, the weight of everything she had carried alone, because the work required it, and the mission required it, and the truth required it, even when the truth could not yet be spoken. She let herself feel it, and her hands were completely steady. Cross stood 2 feet away from her, and he was not steady. But he was present, and presence was what she had needed from him, and it was what he had finally, at the cost of everything it cost him, delivered. She looked at him, he looked at her. 7 years collapsed into the 3 feet of space between them. And the truth which had lived for all that time in classified files and operational reports, and the private memories of 6 men who had come home when they should not have, stepped into the light of a room full people who were now going to carry it forward. Iron Widow, no longer a ghost name, no longer identified. The room did not quiet down quickly. That was the first thing Maya noticed as she stood on that stage with the insignia in her hand. In every other ceremony she had attended in her career, applause followed a predictable arc. It rose, it peaked, it subsided. Rooms returned to their operational baseline because that was what disciplined people in disciplined environments did. They processed emotion, and then they returned to function. This room did not return to baseline quickly. It held its applause for longer than ceremony protocol expected, and in that extended holding, something was being communicated that nobody was putting into words yet. 24 operators and a room full of senior officers were doing the same thing simultaneously, which was revising. Revising their understanding of who was standing on that stage. Revising their understanding of what the past 6 weeks had actually been. Revising the story they had arrived with and replacing it with the story that had just been told in front of them in real time. Revisions of that magnitude take time. Maya let them have the time. Then she raised one hand, not commanding, not silencing, just acknowledging, and the room came down. Cross was still on the stage beside her. He had not moved. She was aware of him in the way she had been aware of him since the first morning of the program, with the particular peripheral attention that 7 years of carrying his name in a classified file had trained into her. But the quality of her awareness had changed. He was not the threat anymore. He was not the obstacle. He was something harder to categorize, a man standing in the public wreckage of a version of himself that he had maintained for 7 years, and the wreckage was genuine, and it was earned, and it was also... She understood the beginning of something rather than the end. She looked at him. He was looking at the floor of the stage. She said quietly enough that only he could hear, "Admiral." He looked up. "You're still standing," she said. He stared at her. For a moment, she was not sure he understood what she meant. Then something moved in his face, not gratitude. Something more complicated than either of those. The expression of a man who has been handed, unexpectedly, a degree of dignity he is not certain he deserves by the person he least expected to hand it to him. He straightened, not dramatically. The way a structure that has been under excessive load for a very long time straightens when the load shifts. "I need to say something," he said, and he meant to the room. She could hear it in his voice, the intention forming in real time. She stepped back from the podium. He stepped forward. The room, which had been settling, went completely still again. Cross gripped the podium the way he had gripped it moments before, but differently now. Not the grip of a man trying to stay upright, the grip of a man using something solid to anchor himself while he says something he cannot unsay. 7 years ago, he said, 6 of us came home from a situation we should not have survived. The official record says we were recovered through combined operational assets. That language was chosen carefully. It was chosen to be accurate without being complete. He stopped. The room waited. The complete version is that one person came for us. Alone. Through terrain that the enemy controlled, and brought us home. His voice changed pitch slightly, just enough that the people listening recognized it as involuntary. I knew that. Not everything. Not her name. But I knew that the rescue was not what the record said it was. And I allowed that record to stand. He paused. I allowed it to stand because examining it closely would have required examining decisions that preceded it. Decisions at the command level, including decisions I was responsible for. He was not reading from anything. There was nothing in front of him. He was doing what Maya had learned to do years ago, speaking from the place where the actual truth lived rather than the place where the managed version of it was stored. When Lieutenant Commander Caldwell was assigned to this program, he continued, I questioned her qualifications. I questioned her record. I questioned whether she belonged here. A pause long enough to be felt. Every question I asked was built on information I had chosen to keep incomplete. And that is not something a commanding officer does to an operator. That is something a frightened man does to a threat. The room absorbed that. I am not going to enumerate what I did in this program over the past 6 weeks. The people in this room who were present know what happened. The record that Commander Whitmore has maintained knows what happened. What I want to say is this. He looked across the room, and then he looked at Maya directly. The Naval Special Warfare community's credibility is built on one thing. Not medals, not records, not institutional prestige. It is built on the willingness to look at what is true and call it what it is, even when calling it what it is costs something. He held her gaze. I failed that standard for 7 years. I am not going to continue to fail it in this room. He stepped back from the podium. He looked at Maya. She looked at him. And then Cross, 61 years old, 35 years of service, the most decorated officer in the Naval Special Warfare Center, did something that the room would describe differently to different people in different conversations for years afterward. Because what he did was simple enough that it could be described factually, but the weight of it, the cost of it, the specific meaning of it given everything that had preceded it, made it something that simple description could not fully contain. He came to attention, and he saluted her. Not the casual professional salute of routine military interaction. The full, deliberate, held salute of one warrior acknowledging another. The kind that means I see you. I know what you did. I am telling everyone in this room that I know. Maya held it for exactly the right amount of time. Then she returned it, and the room broke again. Rear Admiral Sarah Bennett, standing near the front now, looked at Whitmore. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, and something working in his eyes that he was not going to name out loud in a public space. She respected that. She felt something similar. She had run this investigation for 7 years. She had built it carefully, with the patience that classified operations demand and the conviction that the truth had a right to exist even when the truth was inconvenient for everyone involved. She had made the decision to assign Maya to this program as the final phase, knowing that it would put Maya in direct proximity to the person who had most needed to not know who she was. She had run the risk calculation and she had accepted the operational risk, and she had trusted Maya to execute. Maya had executed. Standing in this room watching what had just happened on that stage, Rear Admiral Bennett felt something that she rarely allowed herself to feel in professional context because it was not operationally useful, and she was a person who prioritized operational utility. She felt proud, not of the investigation, not of the outcome, of the person, of what it cost to carry something true for 7 years in silence and carry it cleanly, without bitterness corrupting it, without the weight of it changing the quality of the carrying. She had known Maya Caldwell for 4 years. She had seen her operate in conditions that most people would not believe if described accurately. And in 4 years, she had never seen Maya compromise the thing that made her extraordinary, which was the understanding that the mission and the truth were the same thing and that both deserved to be served with everything you had. Today was everything she had, and it had been enough. At 1500, the formal components of this ceremony concluded, and the room shifted into the particular social mode that follows significant military events. People moving, conversations forming, the processing of what had been witnessed beginning to externalize into language. Mercer found Maya near the edge of the room. He had a glass of water, and he handed it to her without comment because he had observed over 6 weeks that she did not drink during formal events, and that after formal events she was always slightly dehydrated, and that this was a thing he could address without making it a conversation. She took the water. She drank half of it. "How long did you know today was going to go this way?" he said. She looked at him. "Since the assignment brief 3 months ago." "Process that." 3 months. Rear Admiral Bennett and I designed the architecture together. The program assignment, the timeline, the ceremony moment. She paused. "We did not design Cross's reaction, that we had to build in as a variable. You trusted that he'd react the way he did. I trusted that he was still the man who led that team in Afghanistan," she said. "Whatever he did in the 7 years after, he was once someone who led people into genuinely dangerous situations and carried the weight of their lives. That does not entirely leave a person. She looked toward where Cross was standing across the room in conversation with Rear Admiral Bennett. His posture was different from any posture she's seen from him in 6 weeks. Something in it had changed irreversibly. He was carrying guilt he hadn't named as guilt. When the name was given to it, he knew what to do with it. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a generous reading of a man who spent 6 weeks trying to destroy you. Yes, she said, it is. He looked at her. How? She thought about the ridge, about 400 meters in the dark, about the sound of his breathing. Because I carried him, she said simply. It's hard to stop caring whether someone survives after you've carried them. Mercer had no response to that. He stood with it. Then he said, what happens to him now, professionally? That's Rear Admiral Bennett's determination, she said. The investigation's conclusion is negligence rather than intent. The compounding factors, the self-protection, the choices in this program, those are going to require accountability. The specific form of that accountability is above my operational level. Are you going to advocate for him? She looked across the room at Cross again. I'm going to tell the truth, she said. I told the truth today. I'll tell it in whatever formal context requires it. The truth includes what he did in this program, and it includes what he did on that ridge in Afghanistan, and it includes everything in between. All of it. She turned back to Mercer. The people who decide what accountability looks like can work with the complete truth. He nodded slowly. You're not a simple person, Caldwell. No, she agreed. I'm not. He almost smiled. I'm glad I stopped being an idiot about you somewhere around week 2. She looked at him with the expression that lived adjacent to warmth in the emotional vocabulary she had developed over years of operating in environments where warmth was a liability. Week 3, she said, the tidal variance question. He thought about it. You're right. Week 3. He paused. For what it's worth, when I corrected completely. I know, she said, I noticed. Cole Bennett, appeared at the edge of their conversation with the slightly uncertain posture of a man who is not sure he has the right to be in this particular space and is entering it anyway because he has decided potential value outweighs the potential rejection. He looked at I owe you more than an apology, he said. I know that. An apology is a starting point, not a resolution. She looked at him steadily. What does resolution look like to you? He thought about that. Really thought about it. The thinking was visible on his face, which was different from the face he had worn in the first weeks of the program. That face had been assembled. This one was working in real time. I don't know exactly, he said, but I know that the first step is being in rooms where the truth is being told and not being one of the people making it harder for the truth to be told. He met her eyes. I was one of those people. I want to be the opposite of that. She looked at him for a long moment. You started being the opposite of that when you told me about the vest, she said. And when you told me about Cross's call, those were hard things to say. You said them anyway, he exhaled. I should have said them sooner. Yes, she agreed. But you said them when you were ready, which is better than saying them when you weren't. He nodded. Then he said something that she had not expected from him, had not built into any calculation or timeline or operational architecture, something that arrived from a direction that the planning could not have anticipated because it came from a genuine place rather than a strategic one. I want to be the kind of officer that you are, he said. I don't mean the classification level or the record or the Afghanistan operation. I mean the way you carry things, the way you decide. The way you stay straight even when everything around you is designed to push you crooked. He paused. I want to be that. I don't know how to get there from where I am. But I want to try. Maya looked at him, and she said something that she had not planned to say, something that emerged from the same place Cross's salute had emerged from, the place where the actual truth lived. You're already on the way, she said. The wanting to is the beginning of the getting there. He nodded once and walked away with something in his posture that had not been there when he walked up. Harlow appeared next, the quiet Texan. He stopped in front of her and he did not construct any preamble. I knew from the maritime exercise, he said, not who you were. But what you were, what did you know, she said. That you'd navigated that current before. Not that specific current, but that kind of dark, that kind of pressure, that kind of weight. He paused. You don't navigate that way from training. You navigate that way from surviving. She held his gaze. You were right. He nodded. I just wanted you to know that somebody in this program figured it out before the ceremony. A pause. Even if I didn't know the full version. The full version was not mine to share before today, she said. I understand that, he said. I just wanted to say it. He walked away. Torres came next, and his approach was different from all of them. Because Torres was younger than the others, 27, the youngest in the program, and what was on his face was not the complicated renegotiation of the older operators. It was something cleaner, closer to the surface. I'm going to remember today for the rest of my career, he said. She looked at him. Why? Because I've been in this community for 4 years, and I've been told a lot of things about what it means to be an operator. What the standards are, what the values are, what the tradition is. He paused. Today was the first time I watched someone live every single one of those things simultaneously, in real time, under the most pressure I've ever seen anyone under, and not crack once. He stopped. I want to know how. She considered him for a moment. He was genuine. The question was genuine, and he deserved a genuine answer rather than a managed one. You find the thing that matters more than the pressure, she said. For me, it was the 6 people I was trying to bring home. In Afghanistan and here in this program, the 6 people became the truth. The truth was the thing that mattered more than what Cross was doing, more than the inquiry, more than the vest or the record challenge or any of it. She paused. When you find the thing that matters more, the pressure doesn't disappear. You just stop giving it more weight than it deserves. Torres looked at her for a long moment. The thing that matters more, he said. How do you find that? You ask yourself what you'd carry up a 400-meter ridge in the dark, she said. Whatever the answer is, that's it. He stood with that for a moment. Then he said, thank you, Commander. She nodded. He walked away. At 16:30, Rear Admiral Bennett pulled Maya aside. They stood in a quiet corner of the room, the two of them, with the particular quality of privacy that exists in the middle of a crowded space when 2 people have enough shared history that the crowd around them becomes ambient rather than present. How are you? Bennett said. Maya thought about the question with the same seriousness she gave every question. Lighter, she said, which I did not expect. Bennett looked at her carefully. You expected to feel like loss. I expected it to feel like exposure, she said. Classified things stay classified for reasons. The reasons don't always disappear when the classification does. The operational reasons are managed, Bennett said. The asset network considerations have been addressed. The disclosure today was controlled, and the controlled portions will remain controlled. She paused. What you're feeling is not exposure, it's decompression. Maya considered that. Decompression, she repeated. You've been running at operational depth for 7 years, Bennett said. Today you came up, that takes adjustment. She held Maya's gaze. Let it take adjustment. You've earned the surface. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Cross. The accountability process will be fair, Bennett said. I've made that commitment and I'll honor it. The investigation conclusion is clear on intent versus negligence. The compounding factors will be weighted accordingly. She paused. He is not going to prison, Maya. He is going to face a formal review that will likely result in the end of his active command career. He will retire with reduced honors. The record will be corrected. The record will reflect the rescue accurately. The rescue will be documented with your name attached to it, Bennett said. Not in the classified archive, in the accessible record. Iron Widow will have a face and a name and a service history that anyone with appropriate clearance can verify. She paused. It took 7 years, but it is going to be correct. Maya absorbed that, the accessible record, her name attached to what she had done. Not for recognition. She had operated for years in conditions where recognition was not the point, but for accuracy. because incomplete records were how bad decisions compounded across time, and she had been an incomplete record for 7 years, and the incompleteness had cost her things she could not fully enumerate but could fully feel. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in the full weight of the words rather than the social function of them. Bennett looked at her for a moment. "What's next for you?" she said. Maya thought about what Whitmore had said 3 days ago, about the preliminary assessment folder on his filing cabinet with the handwritten annotation, about Mercer during the title variance question, about Harlow on the maritime evaluation team saying you've done this before, about Torres asking how. She thought about a room full of people who had revised their understanding of something important. "I've been asked to consider an instructor role," she said. Bennett raised an eyebrow. By Whitmore, she confirmed. And by Cross before today, as a formal program recommendation. Bennett's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it. "Cross recommended you as an instructor 3 days ago," Maya said. "He submitted the recommendation through Whitmore's office. Whitmore forwarded it to me without comment." She paused. "I think it was his version of beginning to correct something, before he knew today was going to be what it was." Bennett was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's not the action of a man who is entirely what his worst choices suggested." "No," Maya said, "it isn't." Bennett looked at her. "Are you going to take it?" Maya thought about the room she had stood in for 6 weeks. About 24 operators who had arrived with fixed ideas and departed with revised ones. About the value of being the revision. About scenario 15 and document the decision and bring your people home. About Torres asking how you find the thing that matters more. "Yes," she said, "I am." 1 month later, the Naval Special Warfare Center's advanced program began a new class. The roster carried 30 operators. The program had been expanded following a command-level review of the previous class's evaluation data, a review that Whitmore had requested and that Rear Admiral Bennett had supported, and that had resulted in 3 specific changes to the program architecture. The assessment criteria had been updated to weight environmental reading and information synthesis alongside physical performance metrics. The classification of the investigation results had been managed in a way that permitted a sanitized briefing for program leadership. And the instructor roster had one new name, Lieutenant Commander Maya Caldwell. She stood at the front of the room on the first morning of the new class and looked at 30 operators who were looking back at her with the particular combination of curiosity and assessment that new arrivals in elite programs always brought. Some of them knew her name. A few of them knew what the name meant. Most of them knew only that she was new to the instructor role and that the program had recently gone through something significant and that the specifics of that something were above their current clearance level. They were forming opinions. She could see them forming. She recognized the process because she had watched it run in real time for 6 weeks from the other side. She let them form. Then she spoke. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Maya Caldwell. My call sign is Iron Widow. I'm your primary instructor for the decision-making and environmental assessment components of this program." She paused. "I want to tell you something before we begin, and I want you to hear it as information rather than as motivation, because motivation fades and information doesn't." The room was quiet. 30 people listening the way people listen when they are genuinely uncertain what is coming. "This program is going to test you in ways you have prepared for and in ways you have not," she said. "The ways you have not prepared for are the ones that matter most. Because the gap between your preparation and reality is where you discover who you actually are. Not who you trained to be. Not who your record says you are. Who you actually are." She let that settle. "My job is not to tell you who that is. My job is to create the conditions in which you find out for yourself." A hand went up near the back. She recognized the type. Young, confident, the particular confidence of someone who has not yet encountered the specific situations that reorganize confidence into something more useful. "Question," she said. "Is it true the operator said that you conducted a solo rescue of 6 SEAL operators in Afghanistan?" The room held itself very still. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Without authorization? The extraction window had been extended past safe parameters by command decision, she said. I made a field decision to initiate movement rather than accept a failure outcome that the command decision was producing. She paused. I documented the decision. I accepted the accountability. I brought the people home. She looked at him steadily. Does that answer your question? He held her gaze. What happened to the operators you rescued? She thought about Cross, who was in the process of a formal review that would end his active command career and correct a 7-year record. She thought about 5 other men spread across the special operations community who had known her name for 7 years and had carried it the same way she had carried theirs. She thought about the letters she had received in the 2 weeks since the ceremony, 6 of them, one from each survivor, in varying lengths and varying vocabularies, but all carrying the same essential content. They remembered. They had always remembered. They went home, she said. That was the mission. The mission was completed. The room absorbed that. Then a different hand went up. Near the middle, a quieter operator, the kind who listens before they speak, which was, in Maya's experience, the kind worth paying attention to. What's the hardest thing about the kind of decision you made? This one said. The field decision to move when command said to hold. She looked at him for a long moment. It was a real question and it deserved a real answer. Accepting that you might be wrong, she said, and moving anyway. Because the cost of being wrong in the direction of action is usually recoverable. The cost of being wrong in the direction of inaction, when people's lives are the variable, is not. She paused. The hardest thing is not the decision itself. It is holding the weight of it afterward. Whether it worked or whether it didn't, the weight is the same. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when they have received something that will stay with them. She looked at 30 operators who were in the process of becoming something they could not yet fully see. She thought about Mercer, who had requested a permanent assignment to the training command and was going to be on her instructor team starting next month. She thought about Cole Bennett, who was 2 weeks into a deployment that he had entered as a different version of himself than the one who had arrived at this program. She thought about Harlow, who had sent a 2-sentence message the day after the ceremony that said, I knew from the current. Thank you for bringing people home. She thought about Torres, who was in this new class. He was sitting in the 3rd row, and he was looking at her with the particular expression of someone who is exactly where they knew they needed to be. She thought about Whitmore, who had placed a folder in a filing cabinet with a handwritten annotation and bought 12 days of time with a kind of quiet professional courage that does not produce medals but produces things more important than medals. She thought about Cross, who had asked her 3 days before the ceremony, in a hallway outside the equipment room, in the voice of a man who has stopped managing something and started facing it, do you hate me? And she had looked at him, and she had thought about 400 meters in the dark, and she had told him the truth. No, she had said, I needed you to face something. There is a difference. He had stood with that for a long moment. Then he had said, how do you carry it? All of it. For 7 years, how do you carry something that heavy and stay straight? She had thought about that question carefully, because it deserved careful thought. You find the thing that matters more than the weight, she had said. For me, the thing was the truth that those 6 people came home. The truth that what happened in those mountains deserved to be in the accurate record. The truth that strength is not the same as size and authority is not the same as right. And the mission always matters more than the person running it. She had paused. You carry it because putting it down would mean leaving it, and leaving it would mean accepting that it doesn't matter. And it matters. It has always mattered. He had nodded. He had walked away, and she had stood in that hallway and understood that the weight she had been carrying for 7 years was not entirely gone. It was redistributed, carried now by more people, by a room full of operators who had witnessed something real, by a formal record that would now say her name, by an institution that had slowly and imperfectly and at significant cost done what good institutions do when they are working the way they are supposed to work. It had looked at the truth and called it what it was. Now she stood in front of 30 new operators on the first morning of a new program, and she felt the weight of what she carried as something clarified rather than diminished. Clear weight was different from unclear weight. Clear weight could be assessed and distributed and carried intelligently. It did not crush, it built. She looked at the room. "We begin today," she said. "Whatever you came in here believing about yourself, leave it at the door. Not because it's wrong, because this program is going to show you a more accurate version of it, and you will need the space." She paused one final time. The mission does not care what your record says. The truth does not negotiate with comfort. And iron, she said, and let the words stand alone for a moment in the air of that room, does not break. 30 operators looked at her, and Lieutenant Commander Maya Caldwell, call sign Iron Widow, looked back at them, and the weight she carried was exactly right, and her hands were exactly steady. And the truth she had brought home from the dark of an Afghan mountain 7 years ago stood in full light at last, permanent and unchallenged, and finally, completely her own.